brought to you in part by Howard Products. Since 1969, Howard Products has made a wide range of polishes and wood finish restorers. Their hit products, such as Restore Finish and Feed and Wax, have been used in the vintage audio industry for decades, enabling vintage audio enthusiasts to keep their equipment looking as good as they sound. If you want to find out more about Howard Products or to take a look at their product range to see what you can use to bring your equipment back to life, check out www.howardproducts.com. This is the Vintage Audio Series podcast here on eCoustics. I am your moderator for this fantastic, this revolution of conversation here with Eric Pye, Audio Love YYC, and Jeremy Sikora, Budget Audio Filer. And today's conversation is one that I have been greatly looking forward to. Because I have seen both of these gentlemen's turntables so many gosh darn times in so many different ways. And truthfully, so many different turntables, especially with you, Jeremy. But the conversation on this one is all about the turntable, getting a little bit into the cartridge. And guys, I'm excited. So thanks for sharing this one with us, Eric. Take it away.
Okay. So yeah, turntables. I think, vinyl and turntables is, we've had podcasts in the past where we've done roundtables talking about, what's the attraction to vinyl and that kind of stuff. And I think if you want to talk rituals, the whole ritual of, taking the album out and taking it out of the sleeve and placing it on the turntable, flipping partway through multiple times if you're listening to 45 RPM audiophile versions, which I've sworn off now. But central to that whole thing is the turntable. So yeah, that's our topic tonight. We're going to talk about a little bit about different kinds of turntables. So, early on in the turntable history, they were all manual. You would have to push a button to get the platter to start spinning. You would have to, in some cases, wait several seconds for it to get spinning up to speed because they were heavy platters that took a while to get going. You would have to, manually move the tone arm over. In some cases, you had a cueing lever, or in others, you would have to, slowly place it down with your fingers. And then at the end, you would have to, there was no automatic stuff to this at all. You would have to actually lift the turn arm back and put it back and then click the button and have it turn off. Some of the later developments automated some of those functions. You have semi-automatic turntables where you have to do the starting bit, getting the platter going, which often happens when you move the tone arm over, but it actually lifts up at the end, moves itself back, and shuts off the motor so that, if you happen to be having a drink or something while you're listening to your record and fall asleep, you're not going to end up kind of cutting through the vinyl at the end of it because you wake up 8 hours later and it's been going all night. And then you've got the fully automatics where Jeremy and I both have dual 701s where you click a lever to start, it starts up, it picks up the tone arm, it moves it over, it knows where to drop it for a 12-inch record, it drops it, and then it does the finish at the end. So, those are some of the things that we will talk about. And then, the different kinds, you've got the belt drives, which are probably the most common turntables these days. A lot of the ones you see, some of them have automatic speed change. Some of them you actually have to move the belt to a different spindle to change the speed. And then, your direct drives where there is no belt. There's a motor kind of like at the bottom of the spindle that turns. And, the dual 701s that Jeremy and I both have are both direct drives like that. So, yeah, looking forward to talking about all things turntable.
Well, Jeremy, what do you kind of see and what do you recommend most often from a vintage standpoint to people that are looking to get their first vintage table?
So the first thing is, quite frankly, is budget, because turntables, you can buy a turntable in literally any budget, like anything from $50 to tens of thousands of, probably hundred thousands of dollars. I mean, they get to the
Most
point
definitely.
that they're works of art at this point in time. But you can get a great table for $100, $200. So, from a beginner's point of view, I am a personal fan of, at the very least, semi-automatic, which will have you set the tone arm where you want it to start playing, and then once it's done, it's going to lift up the tone arm, and sometimes it lifts it, returns it, and then shuts it down. So, not I have one of each of all the different kinds. So, there's kind of a time and a place, but the ones I use the most are probably the semi-automatic. And when I'm setting up a vintage system for somebody who's new to the hobby, it's most likely a Techniques direct drive. And
Like silver from the 70s.
Yep, the SLs.
Yep. Oh yeah.
And those pretty much any of the SL line is a really great place to start. Lots of flexibility with cartridges in the future, and a little cleaning goes a awful long way, and those things will work for decades upon decades, quite frankly.
Funnily enough, my first turntable was a Technics SL220. It was a belt drive, but besides the belt versus direct, I think operationally it was probably the same. And yeah, it was simple to set up, simple to do everything.
Yeah, those are great places to start. Oddly enough, I started when I was probably 5 years old, when my grandmother gave me a portable and her 45 collection, and then I had since built up on those 45s, and I kept those all the way until CDs came out. Then I gave them all away. Then the digital music came along, and there's no vinyl in the house whatsoever, until my neighbor gave me his Techniques, and he's like, "I'm done with vinyl. Take it." And he gave me all of his records, and it sat there for probably about 6 months until one of us said, "Hey, we should make this work." And when we did, that quite frankly started what you see on the feed, which was one turntable. So that grew into everything, literally everything. So vinyl, I think, gets people into vintage, because vinyl is in itself vintage. So you can get a new turntable, you can get a vintage one, but I honestly think, dollar for dollar, some of those Techniques are going to be your best entry level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my first real table, I guess, was the Pioneer PL12D, and sitting right here next to me still, with a Denon card on it. But the build quality and the excitement of like changing a belt. I distinctly remember the first time changing a belt on that table, and just like being nervous about it. Like, am I going to bust this thing? And just having to remind myself how normal of a process that this was for so many years. I think is very cool. And there's a lot to be learned in those practices. Eric, what are you currently rolling as your main deck over there?
So the one I'm using a lot right now is the Dual 701, which is a direct drive, fully automatic. That's the one that you can see on this side. And then on this side, I have a Denon, which is also a direct drive. That's a semi-automatic. I have to cue the record at the beginning. It lifts the tone arm and stops the platter at the end, but it doesn't actually move it back to the start position. Both fantastic tables. I have to say I'm a big fan of direct drive tables. I think belt drives are probably a bit. Most of the cheaper turntables are going to be belt drives, just because they're a little bit easier. I did have a belt drive a while ago that I sold to our chief editor. That was a Yamaha YP 701. which I bought because I couldn't find a dual 701, and I wanted to have a turntable that had a 701 in it. Yeah, that was a great table as well. And then upstairs in the living room, I have a linear tracking techniques that was a hand me down from my mom when she moved up here.
Can you explain that?
So yeah, on a regular turntable, you have a tone arm that is straight, and it is on a fulcrum at the weighted end, and then it describes an arc across the record as it plays. And there are a lot of well, not a lot of audiophiles, but there are some audiophiles who believe that you're going to not hear the true music because there's going to be a timing difference in terms of, you're not running the needle in a straight line across the record, which is how it was cut. So what a linear tracking turntable does is it does away with the arm, and it has like a little motor that moves your cartridge in a straight line across the record. Jeremy has a Marantz that is very, very sexy of that type.
It is.
Yeah, so they were kind of a fad in the I guess the early mid 80s. Techniques made quite a lot of them.
Mhm.
They're great tables. I honestly can't really hear the difference in terms of, whether it's straight or has a slight arc. But you'll see some of the fancy turntables, they actually make the tone arms much longer than normal, and that's to make the arc flatter and to reduce whatever kind of issues are going to develop from the fact that your needle's not running straight across the record.
What's your experience with the linear tracking, Jeremy?
So I have two of them. I have the Marantz SLT 12 that you spoke of, which is a 60s one.
Oh, cool.
It is one of the early ones, and it is an absolute tank. Everything is heavy to do with it. I get asked a lot of questions on how much does the turntable weigh, how much does the platter. So there's kind of a view that the heavier the better, and that's most likely the case for the older ones, but for the newer ones, there's a whole lot of technology helping out. So so the other one is a 80s Luxman, and the interesting thing about that is they kind of came back because the buttons came back, so you can actually cue the record and watch it move over. They actually had that remote controllable too, so you could change a record song without getting up. And
Gosh,
so
that's cool.
so that was the coolness factor of the inconvenience of vinyl put into the hand of not a small remote control in the 80s.
Wow.
Now, so for the Marantz, it is not easy to set up. It has to be perfectly level. You have to. I had to shim it with a piece of paper. Like it's just an ornery table, but it is the only table in the house that spins exactly at 33.33 without any adjustable dials on it. It just spins, and I have no idea how. And it sounds great, but it has a factory Shure cartridge in it. And you're going to hear that name come up a lot because everyone's a fan of those cartridges.
Yeah. Do you want to kind of lead off with that a little bit? I mean, I think the timing was right to go from linear tracking into Shure carts. I mean, kind of.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, so kind of the heart of the turntable is the cartridge, and there's three main kinds of them. Actually, two: moving magnet, and moving coil. So and MC. is the most common. So if somebody says I'm selling a cartridge, or you see it advertised, 90% of the time it's going to be a moving magnet. You go to the standard entry level table, it's always going to have those. If it's a moving cartridge, a moving coil, then you're going to know that it's a little bit on the higher end, and you're going to need something different in either a phono preamp or a receiver that can accept an MC cartridge.
Correct.
So yeah, so once you get into that curiosity, there were receivers that right out of the factory had that capability. And then there's also phono preamps, which we will get into as well. And that allows you to kind of tune in your moving coil listening. And then there's also mono, which Eric will most likely touch on from the jazz point of view.
Yeah,
And
it's funny. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mitch. No,
I was just going to say real quick as a clarifier that not even as a clarifier, just adding to the MM and MC conversation, your moving coil cartridge, the majority of the time is going to be a much lower output. It's going to be a much quieter cartridge. And so when you have a separate input on the back of your receiver or your external phono preamp, a lot of times there's switches on there to up the gain for a moving coil. So going quieter with the cartridge, your other equipment then has the burden of making all of that louder. So that's the kind of, in a nutshell, the difference a little bit.
Yeah, one of the other cool things about moving magnet and moving coil is, with moving magnet, you can replace the stylus without having to actually remove the cartridge from your head shell. And replacing a stylus is, you can replace stylus from a conical to an elliptical. There's all different kind of shapes that get into different depths in the grooves and give you more or less detail. And so some of the more expensive moving magnets are, they're pretty high quality cartridges. But the fact is that you can replace just the stylus, and that's a super easy thing to do. You can order one in, and you just pull the old one out, and you stick in the new one. With a moving coil, you have to have them retipped because there is no removal of the needle, and so that can be a pain, especially if you don't have a huge collection of cartridges and you have to send your cart away to be retipped. It could take several weeks, and it's going to cost quite a lot of money to get it retipped. So I think that's another one of the reasons why moving magnet is just so popular, is because it's easy. But to move on to the mono, I'm a jazz listener, and I don't actually have a mono cartridge yet. But having talked with Mitch a little bit before the broadcast here, I'm thinking I should probably get one because they have a much lower noise floor. But basically, a lot of the jazz in the 50s and 60s, particularly in the 50s, was recorded in mono. And so, I just play it back on a stereo cartridge, and it sounds fine. It tracks fine. It plays fine. There's no issue in the playback. But I'm now curious to actually try out a mono cartridge, and because a lot of the jazz listeners, they go on and on and on about how the original monos are the best sounding vinyls, and I haven't really noticed that big a difference yet. But I have a feeling now that if I do change my cartridge, that maybe I'll finally the penny will drop and it'll click for me, and I'll be like, oh my god, and I'll go out and replace all of my stereo jazz with new monopresence.
I'm not promising anything along that regard.
Yeah.
I just notice I do notice a sonic difference between playing back a mono recording with a mono cartridge. But
sense. Totally makes sense.
And the majority of the records that that are purchased or that are readily available, even if it is mono, it is cut on with a stereo cutting head. You can still cut a mono recording, and so playing back, if you have a mono recording, yes, it says it on the back of the record. Yes, it will work on your stereo equipment. Vice versa, it will work. Like Jeremy, you mentioned, portable players too, and some of those older portable players are mono. Yeah, they'll still play a stereo record, but then you're going to get into some phasing issues a lot of times if it wasn't mastered or mixed very well, and it can sound a little funky. But it's an interesting ride nonetheless. It still plays music. So
it's funny because I can remember living in South Africa as a kid, and my parents having a turntable where it had a mono and a stereo stylus on the same cartridge, and there was like a little lever that you moved sideways, and it would basically flip the needle, and you could then play all of your records on the same cart, and you didn't have any issues with sounding like you're on LSD.
I've got some of those that have 70 with the lever in its mono, but it's 78 playback on one
Okay.
side and
Okay.
33 playback on the other. Those are
Wow.
kind of neat vintage carts for sure.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, one of the guys that owns one of the record stores, like, well, my cartridge is broken. I got to get a new cartridge. And I'm like, how do you break your cartridge? And he broke the stylus off. I'm like, you can just replace that piece right there, right? And he's like,
No.
I'm like, can I come back there? And I literally pulled the stylus, the entire thing off. I'm like, this is how easy it is. Like, you just buy this part here, slide it right back in. He's like, no. I'm like, yeah, that's it.
Let me just touch on my Empire, which I sold.
Did you really?
I sold it. Yeah.
That.
I sold it because I could only play half my records on it.
Why?
And the reason I couldn't play the other half was because the hole in the middle was too small to fit on the spindle, which on that turntable, I think was just a touch bigger than modern spindles.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a feeling that on modern records, they're making the spindle slightly tighter to get a really, really good clamp when you put the record on. And so that combination of a slightly bigger spindle and modern records with slightly smaller holes meant that the other option I was going to have to go through was to go out and buy myself a borer to increase the size of the holes on half my records. And I didn't feel like doing that. So I sold it.
Yeah.
Perfecto.
With the beautiful deck.
Yeah, I know.
Yes, it most definitely was. So Jeremy, shifting gears here real quick, a little bit. I'm looking for my first turntable, and I don't want to, my vibe is I want to go vintage. I want to buy something on the used market. What tips? What should I be looking for?
Sure. So there's a handful of things to look for. The type which we touched about, I would recommend going at the very least semi-automatic. You don't really need automatic. Semi-automatic, it just makes for a great listening experience. I'm also a big fan of the detachable head shell. And what that means is you can have multiple cartridges and multiple head shells. So you can swap for a different sounding cartridge all the time, and you also have a backup. So in case something bad happens to one, you can just pull out one that's right next to it, screw it in, do a quick alignment, and then you're off to the races. So I like detachable head shells. I also like pitch control. So some all turntables will spin at a certain speed and it most likely will differ throughout its lifetime. So having pitch control can help you dial in. And there's actually a neat little iPhone app or that you can actually use the gyro in the phone to put your phone down, and you can actually dial in the exact RPM. So
it's on Android too.
Yep. Actually, it's called RPM. So that's a neat little tool that it's an easy way to both test your record player, but it's also if you're at somebody's house, you can drop your phone on it and then see where it's at. So
yeah, and that's a really handy one.
See it flutter. Yeah,
it's a really handy one when the turntable doesn't have a strobe on it, because both of my turntables that I'm using now, they have strobes, so it's easy to dial in there. But I did have a turntable before, the Empire, that didn't have a strobe at all, and so using the phone was a great way, because it was adjustable, but it was hard to know what to adjust it to. So
so that's the next thing, a strobe. It's cool. It's cool to have one, because then you can adjust it on the fly. But if it doesn't have one, it's not the end of the world now that we all have phones in our pockets.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips for eras? The questions to either of you, but like eras or brands that were problematic, that were just kind of they were just a bunch of they were lemons. I mean, I distinctly remember there was when I was working in a music shop in college, there were a couple B&O tables that came in, and they were gorgeous. I mean, one of them was a linear tracker, and the other was just a table. And man, they were like kind of fire hazards. Like there were just, but it was like a 70, I would say like a 77, 75 to 77 era, both the tables were. And just take things to a tech, just like what I'm getting at is like take things to a tech. If you're getting something vintage, have it looked at. There's electrical components and all this stuff, and things can go wrong. So yeah, I didn't know if there was anything from that regard that you guys, maybe this would not be a good first one. Things like that.
I just feel like, so if we go back to last episode when we were talking about reel to reels, and Jeremy was talking about how easy it was for him to repair the deck that was fully mechanical. I would say the same thing with the turntables. The more mechanical it is, the easier it's going to be to fix. The more electronics there is. Like I've heard some of the Denon turntables, there are some lemons there because their speed control, their cueing, everything is electronic. And if something goes wrong with the electronics, then I mean, unless you're a very electronically savvy person, you're not going to fix that yourself. Whereas if it's all mechanical, then that's something that you could do probably yourself. Would I be correct there, Jeremy?
Yeah, and I would also add the more non-traditional the deck is, the more difficult it's going to be. So there's a good reason the Moran's SLT isn't around anymore. That's an absolute nightmare to set up, and every time you move it, you have to go through the whole thing over and over again. So yes, it looks cool, but they all have their kind of beast, and all of the B&O stuff looks incredible. But every time I talk to one of the techs, they're like, "Don't bring me that."
That's what
I
the
don't want to
techs
work
said
on that. So the traditional record player is the way it is for a very good reason.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why belt drives and direct drives are so popular. So again, this is something to be looking at. Like some of the dual turntables in the 70s were idler drives, which is like a third kind of drive that was pretty common in a lot of German turntables of the time. And instead of having a belt or a motor that turns the platter, there's a series of gears attached to a motor, and on the outside, there's a wheel that engages with the inside rim of the platter, and the turning wheel turns the platter.
Yes.
I've heard, I've never actually heard one of these turntables myself, but I've heard that the idler drive turntables are some of the best sounding turntables out there. But they are super, super complex. And they're certainly, I mean, if you're thinking about getting one of those, it has to be like done by a tech, or you have to be super mechanically able.
Yeah, those are the dual 1219s and the 1229s.
Yeah,
those are probably the best two out there, and there is somebody in the US that will restore those to an incredible level of quality.
Yeah,
that'd be something to hear.
That would be the guy who built the basis for both of our 701s, would it not?
Yeah, yes, it will, Bill.
Fix my dual.
Yep.
Yeah. But yeah,
is that the guy that you mentioned to me to fix some of my stuff, Jeremy?
He would be the one to bring a dual to. It's
gotcha. Okay.
Literally fixmydual.com. And if you have a dual and want it to be flawless, that's where you send it.
And just as an aside, I mean, this is one of the cool things about vintage equipment is there are people out there who specialize in a particular brand of turntable.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the guy at Audio Nirvana who does Thorn's turntables.
Yeah.
And I've got ADS speakers, and there's a guy in the States, Dr. Richard So, who specializes in ADS speakers and ADS only. He recones, he does like the tweeters, he does all those kinds of things. But sometimes if you do a little research and you're getting a brand and you know that there's somebody out there who can do a kick-ass job of fixing these things, that's really awesome.
Yeah, if you've got if you use the Technics SP series, so my main broadcast tables are the SP15s, and there's a company, a guy Fidelis Analog, who makes a new chip that is it's the programming chip for the pitch control and the speed control that goes bad on those tables over time, and he makes a brand new one that makes the pitch control like increment. It goes down where it's like it can be, instead of like a 0.1%, it can do it in like 0.05%, so it's just like more fine-tuned stuff. So yeah, you're totally right. I mean, go down the rabbit hole on any of those brands, and you're about to find a genius if you look hard enough.
Yeah. Anything else on things to look for, Jeremy?
That's about it. And quite frankly, there's your physical visual preference. Do you want it large? Do you want it something slimline? They have a deck for everyone.
Yeah. Do you want it silver? Do you want a wood base? Those kinds of things too, right? Yeah.
The only other one that I would bring up that I had an issue with when it comes to vintage, even though I think they're stunning tables, is the Philips like 312 series. They've got the ones with the touch sensitive lights for like start and stop, but that light sensor is directly connected to like everything. And so if that light sensor goes off, where you kind of sometimes I'd have to like kind of trick it, like, but it would feel uncomfortable as if I was like kind of scanning my fingerprint. Like, what information am I giving to Holland right now? But if that light was wrong, I could be listening to a record and it would go from 33 to say like 26 RPM, and then it would go to like 41 RPM. It was just one of the weirdest variances. And they're gorgeous, cool sounding tables, but man, the functionality was so tough. But it was that innovation. I mean, there was so much experimentation, innovation into what we have now with all that vintage stuff, and they sound phenomenal. So yeah, I think this was a good episode, guys. Very cool episode, and thank you for sharing your setups and your knowledge. Jeremy, there was only one other thing I did want to add, even though it's not vintage per se, but you did bring up expensive turntables in the beginning of the episode. And I think it would be a misstep if we didn't say that there's also a company that shares your exact name that makes some real works of art.
Yes, there is a Sikora turntable company, and I could most likely afford a shirt from them.
Possibly.
Maybe.
Or you can contact them and ask them to send you one.
No promises there, right?
Yeah, but yeah, those are absolutely beautiful turntables. Yep.
I was gonna say, is your main listening table the Dual right now, Jeremy?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay.
The Dual 701 gets the most use.
With what cartridge?
It is a Shure V15. What's
yours, Eric?
The same one. So the V15, I believe that there was a collaboration with Dual on the 701 for that particular cartridge. And so, I mean, basically almost all the Duals that you would buy when they first came out, they came with the V15-3 standard. So yeah, if you want to talk match made in heaven and all those kinds of things, that is it.
Jeremy, you want to take us home with anything that we might have missed?
Yep. The only thing that I would add to this is watch a video, learn how to set up your turntable, learn how to align your cartridge, learn what the stylus weight is. This is something anyone can do. There's incredible videos out there at YouTube, so we don't even have to explain it. Go ahead and Google away and set up your turntable. You'll get better and better at it, and enjoy the music.
You were the one that made a post, I think, about the alignment disc, and that was a beautiful purchase for me. because I was definitely missing stuff.
I actually heard the difference when I
did
set
too.
up my turntable properly the first time. I actually heard a difference. So when people ask, what can I do to make my music better? I'm like, A, clean your records. B, set up your turntable right. And then lastly, fix your speakers. Fix your speaker placement. Those are all free things to do or very low cost.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this vintage series episode on turntables and cartridges with Eric Pye at Audio Love YYC, Jeremy Sikora at Budget Audio Filer. And I've been your moderator, Mitch Anderson from Black Circle Radio. Remember to subscribe, comment, share it around if you feel like it. And we will see you on this next vintage adventure. Thanks.